Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Cloud Security Management Practices You Might Have Neglected, sponsored by Cisco. My name is Carol Auth-Sands. Today's featured speaker is Jason Lamb, SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Jason. And Jason, your screen here looks great.
Thank you very much, Carol. I appreciate that. And sorry for the later start. I had to reboot my laptop last minute. It's one of those presentation blues, but I'm glad that I'm able to talk to everyone today. So first of all, thanks for coming. This webcast is about the topic of cloud security. This is really intended for management practices that you may have neglected. Hey, if you, at the end of the webcast, you find that you're doing all these things right, congratulations. You are definitely one of those organizations that are doing really well in this area. But let's see whether you are doing it right or wrong, right? And obviously, just like any other webcast, we will take questions towards the end, and you're more than welcome to type in your questions, throughout the webcast, and we'll queue it up and answer them towards the end. With that, I'm going to give you a quick intro of myself before we start. I am Jason Lamb, as Carol have introduced me. At the daytime, I work for a large financial organization at a executive role, managing many different things, amongst that, looking into cloud security. And when I'm not doing my day job, I'm a superhero. That's what I tell people. I teach for SANS, and I, frequent different conferences and talk about security. Most of these days, I spend my time, amongst the cloud and also development. Security development area. So that's me in a nutshell. And today's material comes from the Management 520, which is one of the cyber security leadership courses that SANS offers. It's the MGT 520. It's a new course from last year, end of last year, and we're running it regularly. Hey, if you're interested in some of these topics, definitely look up the course. So with that, let's get going here. So first of all, let's give a little bit of level setting about what this is about, why we're talking about cloud security. Well, clearly, hey, now that you're here, you're interested in cloud security. But let's talk a little bit about why cloud is quite different, and that management folks like ourselves need to pay attention to this area and some of the practices that are quite different than managing, for example, your on-premise environment, some of the more traditional, hosting model, and so on. And well, we all know that cloud is inevitable, right? Like most organizations, one way or another, are adopting cloud, right? And particularly the public cloud area offers a lot of new capabilities, and also some management challenges that we need to deal with that are quite different. Obviously, the elasticity, the fact that you can just turn up, server computers and server computing environment, storage, and any other capabilities, that are related to public cloud, definitely is very beneficial, right? Like, and the cost side of things, knowing that, hey, you pay for what you actually utilize is actually quite good, right? There's no upfront cost. I still remember that, I've managed, a few project and programs that have, front loading costs of like, $20+ million. And then you go through many different approvals. I think the approval for that, that particular project that I have in mind, talk about 6 months, right? Like, as opposed to some of these cloud model where it's a turnkey solution, you go and you launch it, the big data database, you don't have to build all that stuff, right? Like the storage, the hardware and stuff like that. That's quite good. Now, where things are a little bit different is that, when we go and manage them, hey, you're not exactly managing, traditionally, okay, build the servers, take some time, evaluate what we're doing. You don't have that, lead time to catch up on security. And also, once you get going, the pace of change is quite substantial, right? So some of the cloud transformation, on the management side, these 3 bullets on the slide basically sums it up, right? Some of the cloud management that, aspects that you need to pay attention to are like shared responsibility. Part of the cloud are owned by you. Part of the cloud is not owned by you, right? Essentially, we always talk about, the cloud service provider are responsible for the cloud security itself, like the cloud itself, the platform itself, they're responsible for that. But then your data, how you manage, some of the configurations and the data within it, that's your responsibility. And, get together with it, certain level of compliance and so on, that's your responsibility as well. You're not offloading that. And given all that, right, the security management responsibility becomes very different. And also, as I talked about earlier, the deployment pace. Once you get going in the cloud, organizations are reporting that, from, oh yeah, these applications, we're rolling out code every month or every quarter. That's generally the case if you follow the traditional waterfall model in on-premise, sort of setup, right? Like once a month, you're doing pretty good, right? But nowadays, organizations, and many of them, right? Like it's not just 1 or 2, and it's not just the technology company, but even in the financial space, that traditionally things move a little slower. There are projects and programs that roll out code and deploy every single day, right? And if you look at the technology, the unicorn companies, they're rolling out, they're deploying every, almost like 30, 20 times a day. That's substantial, right? How do you actually manage security in that environment becomes a very difficult challenge. From, once a quarter to multiple times a day, that's a huge change. And cloud, while it is not, just because you have cloud, you can do that. Well, you also need the practices and processes to actually support that. Well, that's quite different as well. And lastly, right, like big change that I see is also everything is code, right? Like nowadays, it's not so much, okay, here is development, you guys manage the code, and then, the network people manage, for example, the routers, the switches, and there are OS people. Well, everything is code, right? If you think about, container environment, serverless environment, everything is code, is configuration that actually drives your infrastructure, right? It's also known as infrastructure as code. And those things lead down the path of a lot of changes on how you need to manage your security posture. Because now we're in an age where one single line of code that are wrong, then that has a very bad drastic effect that are cascading across your entire environment. So those are the key driving factor as to why some of the practices that we need to practices that we need in our organization are quite different. And today's presentation, we're going to give you a sample of 3 different areas. Right? We talk about a lot of different areas within the course. I'm going to specifically pick out 3 different ones to give you a sample of, hey, these are some of the practices that are quite different between your on-premise environment and your cloud environment. The first one is about establishing a unified security strategy. The second is about how do you transition security roles? Like, hey, we think about it, yeah, that's logical, that's sensible, but how, right? It's not exactly easy, and I see a lot of organizations struggle here. Now, we also, the first point that we're going to, first practice that we're going to cover is also forget and we learn security best practices. Okay, in security, we generally don't want to forget about things, but this is interesting that, yeah, some of those old things, you gotta be able to forget about it and adopt some new, security best practices. So, these are the things that we want to talk about. And the first one, let's talk about establishing a unified security strategy. First of all here, right? Strategy, I think every management professional understand, yep, you need a strategy that drives your future. But then, there is a path to get to a unified security strategy. Obviously, all organizations will have security strategy. Some plan it a little bit longer than others. Well, clearly, some companies, tend to be in the verticals that moves a little quicker, some a little slower, and your time horizon that you're planning for are not exactly the same. But when you mix in cloud, like for example, when you're transitioning, in the middle of transitioning, early adoption, or even in the midst of, yeah, we're in cloud, we're running, we're pretty good, you're still, you're always in the transitional phase. What I mean by that is, if you think about AWS alone, right? AWS has now like 400 different services, right? Each year the number keep adding, and this is not changing. And whether you are actually going multi-cloud, whether you like it or not, most organizations will adopt multiple different cloud environment. All those things gets into your security strategy being changing, all the time. It's on a constant shift. The question becomes, okay, so we've got an existing strategy. How do we keep it fluid? How do we keep it, well, both fluid and lock down, anchor down? Because there are certain portions that should never change, right? The fact that we need the security strategy, that should never change. Now, how do you actually, manage that? It's really the question, right? And earlier, as I talked about, the pace of change is daunting to everyone. And well, it's not a surprise that even the very successful company are always in a state of flux, changes, and so on. But the question is, like, how do you coordinate all the teams together, right? Again, there will be certain level of people who are focused more on the network side. There are always obviously people who are focusing more on translating business logic into code, well, namely the development teams. How do you align them? Because if you don't align them, what happens is that the teams are going to work in isolation, right? Like, hey, all the teams, I strongly believe that everybody is trying to do the best job they can. But then, the best job in their own mind may not exactly be fully aligned with the actions of others. And, if there is no unified security strategy, what's going to happen is that each action may undermine each other's effort, right? So this is exactly what we're trying to avoid here. And yes, you do want certain level of friction with these high performance teams environment, but then you really don't want teams to be conflicting with another. Certain level of friction, healthy friction is good, but conflict is not exactly great, right? Conflicts, unhealthy friction, generally, I'll quote Microsoft on this. They've got a good cloud adoption model paper that we can all take a look at. And it's well publicized, on that as part of their Azure cloud adoption framework. Healthy friction is about forcing the critical thinking at the right time. What it means is, think about threat modeling. Trust that most organizations these days, do threat modeling, by bringing all the development team, all the business team together into a, hopefully in a virtual room or a room, and have a discussion about what are some of the threats, what are some of the, things that you would worry about, in your application environment, in your cloud environment, and what would the miscreant, the bad guys actually put into your environment, right? Like how would they hack you? And what mitigations you have, that could defend against that, and whether you have sufficient amount of control. That would be the exercise of threat modeling, and definitely most organizations are, either adopted it, well on their way to adopt it, or just starting somewhere, right? So those are healthy practice that, yep, you take your stance, from a business side. I'll take my stance from, for example, the security side, and we collaboratively, do something that is constructive to identify the risk in the environment. What unhealthy really means is that you're impeding more value than it protects, right? For example, right, this one originate from security area a lot. In a lot of organizations, you have these security scanners, be it code level scanner or just vulnerability scanner on the infrastructure. And well, all organizations need to have it because we all have auditors, right? We all have compliance requirements. So, as you try to scan your environment, if your scanner is false positive prone, and all application level scanners tend to be, at a certain point, right? So there will be false positive. And if there are no process to actually trim down on that false positive, then you generate a lot of unhealthy friction, right? So what happens is, the security department may say, hey, here are some, vulnerabilities, and you have got developer or cloud professionals that are, going around trying to look for it, and then wasting about, days to weeks, and then come back and say, hey, this doesn't work, right? Like this just isn't there. And then, going back and forth, I've seen organizations that go, waste months of time just looking at these. Those are unhealthy friction because that's not conducive and not helpful within your entire security context, right? Like it doesn't drive anything forward. Now, where things are good is that, the unified security strategy means that, everybody is aligned. But getting to that alignment usually does not go bottom up. What it means is, if some junior team members, not saying that they're not important, they're super important to the overall success of the organization. But if one person just raise their hand and say, I need to do, get a unified security strategy, that's not going to fly very well, right? So generally, these activities require the support of, senior leadership, the CISO, the CTO, the CIO. These are the leadership roles that actually help out to drive and sponsor the program, right? So if you're not in those roles, don't worry, right? This is all is not lost. Campaign for the change, and that's exactly what you would want to do, right? These are things that just require sponsorship, and believe me, like the strategy is not built just by them. What it is, who built this actual strategy is that all the teams involved in the cloud environment need to be involved in the security strategy. What it means is that your development team definitely has a big role. Your architecture, your policy, risk area, they definitely have a big hand into having the discussion, having their input into the security strategy. And I would say that in my personal experience, the business team also have a very big hand into it as well. And needless to say, your legal team, those are the big components of the teams that actually form and build your security strategy. What that means is that you would want to consult and make sure that the security strategy is agreeable by them, because ultimately they will be part of the team that are going to carry out the strategy as well. And you would want to drive shared ownership, right? The strategy is not about, hey, what would the security team perform? The strategy needs to be, what would the organization as a whole advance forward with, and what would the organization do in the new world, as you carry out the security strategy. And how do you build for that, right? The building of it is, you would definitely, want to pick on certain topics and get all these stakeholders, as I talked about earlier, to formulate their thoughts and what would the security end state looks like, right? And what ultimately you're trying to drive for shared goals. The share ownership in this particular area is really important because again, ultimately, if one team has a different view, then you may not be as successful. So, you would again want to align with your business and IT partners in achieving the mutual goals, in setting the mutual goals, lock it down for your team to achieve, and that would be the ideal state. So generally, organizations tackle network area because network in the on-prem model to the cloud model, there goes a lot of transitioning. There goes a lot of transformation. So you would want to tackle that, to identify what are the requirements and how do we, protect it. And then software building. Well, as I said, right, like building, from a quarterly basis to, daily basis takes a lot of changes. And, there are a lot of security requirements that changes over there. That goes along with your deployment as well. And one thing that is kind of hidden from a lot of organizations is about your authentication. Generally, your authentication, the directory structure will change substantially, and also your federation level and so on. All those things are big changes. So these are things that require a lot of alignment. And, for the teams that are not exactly front and center for those topics, you can at least advise them of what's coming down the pipeline. This helps you a lot, right? It's about communicating to all and getting their support, right? So, there may be short-term pain in getting through, right? So this is where when you actually campaign for, the changes, help different teams understand, well, why are we taking a step back to step forward? Sometimes helps a lot, right? For example, sometimes, I've seen organizations that transition over to some of those newer authentication models that support the cloud in a big way. Sometimes they take a step backward first. So, having the communication out to everyone, that will generally get you the support. And keeping it up to date is also important, right? I see a lot of organizations, yeah, change, right? Like march forward, but then they don't necessarily, look back at, some of the things that they have done and adjusting the documentation that they have, right? So lastly, on the security strategy, focus on the end goal, less on how to do it, what to use, and things like that. This helps you, this particular practice helps you to go with multi-cloud environment. Again, most organizations are stepping into the multi-cloud environment nowadays, and getting the security strategy aligned to that, is a good thing. And the success factor to it is not just about technology, but more about, the mindset of, yep, we have multiple environments and we need to keep it, at a reasonable level so that you're not staying, oh, I need this particular service only in AWS or Azure, right? Like that won't work, in the new world. So that's really, the security strategy being unified. Now, the other topic that I would like to cover here is about transitioning in security roles. So on this one, I think everyone understands, right? New skills, new environment. Yeah, you just need some, new, either new people or just new, skill set and so on. But I think the fundamental changes are bigger than what, a lot of organizations actually think about, right? So these are practices that need specific planning, and very deliberate planning, and also you require individual level transition plan, right? So for example, well, I'll give you two examples here, right? The responsibility changes, nowadays, by going to cloud, most of the service, cloud native service that you're going to leverage are likely serverless, right? When I say serverless, I'm not just talking about function as a service, but you don't manage servers, right? So the servers management in a lot of times, not all services, but in a lot of times, you're actually offloading that responsibility to the cloud service provider, right? Again, I want to emphasize that point, right? Some of the services are managed by the cloud service provider, some of them yours, right? So for those particular type of services that you're leveraging, you're changing from building it and doing it, meaning, hey, I'm going to go buy some hard drive, I'm going to go, build some servers, I'm going to install some OS. Well, you're no longer doing that, right? Now, a lot of your resources are dedicated to managing either the relationships, making sure you partner with the service provider, making sure you partner internally, so that you translate those business logic a lot quicker, and also managing the configurations, right? Like everything is code and configurations. So those are the changes that you'll see a lot. And then, you also, the focus of, the IT environment tend to change quite a bit as well, right? Like, and security goes along with it. Nowadays, you're not focusing so much on, hey, whether this firewall or that firewall brand, or this endpoint protection or that endpoint protection is better, right? Well, you still need that endpoint protection in a cloud environment, but, just for example, right? You're not looking at it at a micro level of, hey, is this vendor better than that, right? Nowadays, you're like, okay, we're going with GCP, the Google Cloud, and we'll leverage everything that that cloud environment has, all the way from, the load balancer, all the way, from CDN, the content delivery network, all the way to their firewall, to their web app firewall offerings, right? Generally, that's the best practice. So your focus is actually shifting. Now, also perimeter-based security. Hey, what perimeter, right? In the cloud native model, you generally don't pay so much attention on the network perimeter anymore because there's none, right? Nowadays, you're not thinking about the zero trust model, expecting everything to be, internet facing, then you may not be ready for cloud just yet, right? Because that is the natural shift of the environment. So if your teams are still thinking about, oh, I need to, secure my perimeter more, well, then the focus is actually not at the right place. So here are some of the sample roles changes that we see in a lot of organizations. And by the way, some of these tags actually came from Google. They recently published a paper in May of 2021. Is the CISO's Guide to Cloud Security Transformation. I like that paper, right? Like they basically speak to the CISO with the right level of information. And some of these texts came from that paper. If you have a chance, definitely take a look at that. It's a good resource to know and learn. So here are some of I picked on 3 different sample roles that they mentioned. So your security policy, right? Like what the recommendation is that, hey, yes, we all know that security policy need to change, but, do not just assume that your pre-existing, framework and implementation can be reused, right? So refactor, which means, in a lot of big ways, we build your security policy focusing on the right control and use cloud security model. The model changes quite a bit, right? And also your security testing, a lot of organizations were focusing on, well, let's test after, we generate some code ready to go, and then let's do a pen test once in a while. Well, in the cloud environment, that's not the right model, right? Because you're changing so many times. And don't forget, right? Certain environment like your container environment are only up for a few seconds at a time, right? Good luck running the traditional security scanning model, right? It doesn't work. So what you need to do is, like, for example, transition the team in acquiring new skills and new processes, driving new processes to actually test throughout the development lifecycle, right? As people commit code, as soon as they finish writing code, validate whether that's right or wrong or anything need to be fixed. It's very frequent, iterative process. That's really the new security testing model. Well, and this is just an example, right? Like multiple different teams, including the architecture, also need to change as well. But also the development area as well. They have a very heavy role in security now. Again, we're transitioning more things to code. It doesn't mean that the application development world is responsible for everything. However, it tends to seem that they're moving closer and closer with the security team. I've seen in a lot of cases very successful companies and organizations literally have the application development area and some of the security people like sitting side by side, or even virtual team wise, they're sitting, they're within the same team, trying to make sure that all these security practices are enforced and followed, right? Like it's not so much of a suppression, tactics anymore, but more of a supportive, tactics to help them, to aid them, and make sure that, for example, hey, something sprang up from this particular review. How do I fix it now? Rather than, just before you go into production, I caught something and I have to stop the pipeline and fix it. So very early on, sort of detection and response is really necessary. And also, let's talk about how, right? Like, what are some of the attributes of very successful organization from what I've seen? Training, right? And also planning for dedicated resources. What we find, in a lot of organizations in the planning phase is that, oh yeah, we'll hire new people to actually figure out, the secure, to acquire the new skills and so on. Well, what we find and see is that, yes, good goal, but how many people can you actually, hire, right? At this point, there is a huge shortage. Not only is it not practical, but sometimes, hiring new people without your tribal knowledge, right? Like your institutional knowledge, sometimes is not really beneficial. So, when I definitely recommend organizations to look into both. Yeah, acquire new skills, new resources, right? From outside, external hire is good, but also look into a training program and make it, very structured. Again, resources within IT area specifically generally learn really well. Hey, we don't get to the IT world by being stagnated into one skill set, right? Generally, people learn well, but they may not have the time or the formal, structure to actually learn. So, having that sort of structure to actually learn and dedicated time, even if it is just, dedicated time, hey, you go and learn for yourself, that would help them a lot. And make sure that there is a curriculum for every single role in the organization would be a helpful thing, right? Like transitioning, how we would transition one particular on-premise, type of security role or architecture role into a cloud-capable role is really what we're talking about, right? And then for specific areas, knowing that especially during the early transition phase, having dedicated resource seems to be a luxury. But then these are necessary steps, right? It's hard to split roles, given the attention span, the resource, and the skills. It's difficult to split. Okay, you're the architect, you do the on-prem stuff, you do the cloud stuff. Definitely recommend that, in some of the very key positions, make sure that it is, dedicated, right? Think about the planning roles, right? We talk about scout versus SCOT. What it means is that in the cloud area, we are focusing more on scouts, meaning, hey, these are people that watch what cloud demands there will be and setting up the guardrail and guidelines so that, all the security principles, all the security rules and so on are already set up when the developers come and consume them. So that would, alleviate a lot of the friction and get things a lot quicker, right? And all the coordination role, some of the key technical roles also need to be dedicated. That's the learnings from, a lot of the organizations that I talk to. And, essentially, just split roles. If all your organization is split role, that's not going to work too well. And the third topic of the day, in terms of practices, is about forgetting and relearning new security best practices. I would, this is a very bold statement. The first bullet over there, existing on-premise security model is just dangerous for cloud. Well, it's not like it's not optimal. It's actually rather dangerous if you're just doing that. What we're talking about is like, very old components. For example, your intrusion prevention systems and so on. Hey, there's nothing wrong with those systems, being on-prem and so on, right? And even if you were to deploy, what is known as infrastructure as a service, essentially also known as just a bunch of servers, an extension of your data center to the cloud, right? Yeah, maybe you need to deploy that, but in the new world, right, of cloud, that component changed, quite substantially. And if you're focusing on, oh yeah, we needed to have that in our on-prem environment, we must have, the same thing in your, cloud environment. Well, again, as I talked about earlier, if you deploy cloud native environment, right, a lot of the components that you're going to rent from the cloud service provider are actually internet facing. And it is not possible to actually deploy your firewall, your intrusion prevention system there, right? That is how cloud works, public cloud, right? That is how it works. And with that, your security model need to change as well. And that would also mean that your latest and greatest, your big investment into your NG, your new generation firewalls, devices that tend to do everything in security may not be as effective as well, right? Like again, it's not that you're losing that capability, you just need to do it differently, right? And that ties back into some of the things that we're talking about earlier. It's not so much of things that are hey, you were doing it in a particular way in the cloud, you need to do this the same way. It's not like that. And also vulnerability scanning as well, using remote network-based scanning that we traditionally have done for many years, right? In an on-prem environment, yeah, that may not work. Again, how are you going to, I've had multiple conversations with students, with some of the peers. They come to me and say, hey, I've used like Rapid7, Qualys, to scan my network for years. I want to do the same thing with cloud. Well, you can do it for certain portion, but then there are certain portion of the cloud that you do something different, right? That's vulnerability scanning, is transforming quite a bit. If you're only doing what you're used to, that doesn't work, right? So, for example, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I need to scan. I use many different services in Google Cloud. I'm going to scan all of it. When I show them what it means, right? Like you're scanning practically, I call it the entire internet, every single IP out there. Yeah, I think the idea makes more sense, to not do it that way, right? Like in essence, the cloud security model is just very different, right? So historical approaches will need to be updated before implementing in cloud. So a lot of times people confused, what they're doing. Hey, I need to ensure that things are secure, right? Yes, that's a security objective. That does not change. So what you want to do in this particular area is focus on what are the security objectives, and do not assume that existing control will work well for cloud security environment, right? Well, if you're very early on, you're doing exactly what I said, like extending your data center. Oh, here are a couple of servers and stuff like that. You're still running the entire infrastructure on the cloud. Yeah, then your existing security control may continue to work for a little bit. But then once you start, more than dipping your toe into cloud, then you definitely need to, revise your controls. It's about flexibility. So instead of multiple workaround, okay, the security scanner does not work because of IP address. Well, I'm gonna flip the IP address one way or another. I've heard many different organizations trying that tactics, trying to, I call it square peg in a round hole. Essentially, I have this control. I have been using this vendor for so long. I need to use it continually for cloud. It doesn't quite work like that. What I recommend people to do is look at what you're trying to achieve. For example, I am trying to make sure that the cloud, the servers running in cloud, the server that I'm renting, right, in a way, the virtual machines that I'm renting in the cloud are all up to date, right? Well, you may not need or even want to use your existing tooling to do that, right? In fact, some of the cloud service provider either offer, managed service that they manage your OS, or they provide specific tooling that would do that patching for you. Hey, use all that, right? Like adopt cloud native ways. That's what the best practices are. And even in log monitoring, right? That's a very huge component. What I'm talking about is specifically when you do log monitoring, a lot of organizations starting out saying, oh yeah, we've got this thing, either on premise or have another, cloud provider like a Splunk or something like that, to monitor log. Well, I want to export the log from my cloud service provider into my data center and I can analyze them. But very shortly, if you do that very shortly, you're going to find out that, oh, that doesn't work too well. You're transporting a lot of data back and forth, right? And that incur a huge cost. But also, you are on the hook, right? As management, as technical staff, to figure out what would all the monitoring case is. And that takes a substantial amount of effort, right? The best practice nowadays is, well, each cloud service provider has their own, intelligence and so on, embedded within their own log monitoring capability. So use that to your advantage. Use their intelligence, use their use cases, security use cases to monitor, and then funnel the, detected, some of the potential event of interest for further analysis. That's generally, the best practice nowadays, so that you're not wasting a bunch of resources on, in terms of human resources, and also, your bandwidth and so on, right? And as you're doing all these security practices, one of the components is about scalability and automation. A lot of people don't think about these. What it means is that, in cloud, everything needs to be automated, right? If it is not easily automated, don't do it, right? That's why you need to start from the scratch and say, what am I trying to achieve, in terms of using all these control, like firewall, endpoint, and so on. And, in the cloud environment, is there a better way to do it? And this is where, you can consult with your CSP, your cloud service provider, and they're usually very helpful for cost, of course, right? Like they're trying to secure more of your business. So they're particularly helpful in that regards to help you transition. Talking to them, I would say is a good thing to see whether there's a better way to achieve some of those security objectives. With that, that's all I have today. And I would specifically want to thank Cisco for sponsoring this particular webcast. They have different information that you can see on the slide here, different product offerings as well. But I hope you find today's information useful and interesting. Definitely, if you're curious about some more of these information, definitely look up the MGT 520 course, the management cloud course as well. I'm happy to take on questions here. Let me see if there are any questions that are put forth by anyone. Okay. There is a question function, I believe. Okay, let's see here. I am seeing some of the questions coming in. An earlier slide, this is from Jonathan. An earlier slide mentioned that we must unlearn and relearn security best practices, but I don't see where this is represented. Okay. Oh, okay. Learn and unlearn. I can go back to the slide and talk about it. Essentially, I think I gave a couple of examples here, right? So I would say that, the firewall, for example, on a lot of organizations focus on firewalls, right? Like, hey, traditionally we've been doing it for, I've been in security for 25 years at this point. I would say in the last 25 years, there has been a lot of focus on firewall, and rightfully so, right? 15 years ago when there were a lot of worms floating around, yeah, we focus a lot on it. And it's good, right? It helped us navigate around a lot of security problems. But in the new world, right, you have to unlearn the firewall way. Perimeter is not a thing anymore, right? Perimeter security is not a thing anymore. and I think I have an earlier slide as well. Yeah, the perimeter-based model is not conducive to your security anymore. Why? Is because when you use platform as a service type of service offerings, and hint, hint on that, you would find that as you get deeper and deeper into cloud adoption, you are pivoting more and more towards, some of these platform as a service type of service offering, also SaaS as well, right? Service is yeah. So basically, these are not, you don't control your firewall, right? So you can't say I want to firewall off, the Google's cloud. That doesn't work. So what you do instead, to unlearn, hey, stop thinking about firewall. Start thinking about control. The objective is control who has access to your resource. And what you do is, for example, you set up these things called private endpoint in your path, like whatever service it is. There are almost always these private endpoint. You're saying, okay, to the cloud service provider, AWS, and so on. I don't want you, for my particular instance, I don't want it to be internet facing, right? I want my instance in your service offering to be facing only accessible to my own resources. That's what it means. And you're provisioning that either towards some of these virtual network or your identity. Identity effectively become your new firewall. And that's exactly why I said, hey, do not use some of these old security model, because if you focus so much on firewall, you're going to fail, right? So hopefully that answers your question, Jonathan. Hey, if I didn't, feel free to come again. What SANS classes do you think most relative to moving to cloud native solutions? Chris is asking that. Okay, is there a class that covers security, design, and engineering in Azure? Yes, there are. I would recommend, depending on the context of it, there's like 540, which is about the DevSecOps pipeline tools. That's one course that if you're looking at the tooling, that would help you. And then there is also a I believe it's 510. That basically is all the multi-cloud security components. What are some of the important controls that you need to put in, and so on. So hopefully that helps you, right? It's not just Azure, but also all the other clouds as well. Yep. So hopefully that helps you. Since next question is about, since on-prem security is different than cloud-based security, would it be beneficial for a company to have different teams to manage on-prem, different teams to manage the cloud services? Very good question. That came from Emmy. So again, I will flip slides here. I think we did cover a portion of this. I do recommend that organizations start off with who they have, what they have. Generally, what I see is that there are usually consulting or new hire in this particular area. I don't think that just okay, you're the network team that are on-prem, you're the network team that are cloud. That works very well, right? Usually, what I see works well is within the same organization, there are more resources dedicated to cloud, and then slowly but surely transition some of the more on-prem focused resources towards the cloud area. I think that would work a little bit better. And from what I've seen, that transition is a little bit smoother, for skill transitioning and so on. And obviously, I mean, just so we're clear, and you would also need the leadership level to understand what they're actually driving towards as well. It's not so much training the technical resources, but also training a lot of the security leaders and also the network leaders, essentially leaders in multiple areas to drive towards the same goal. And that is a key to the success factor, okay? Okay. still reading here. Andy is asking, any reason why IPS is not recommended in the cloud environment? Okay, so that's related to this slide here. Cool, definitely happy to answer that. So it's not that I particularly call out, oh yeah, don't do IPS. That's not what I said. What I said specifically was more about your IPS, it is sort of a little bit, getting old, right? Like, it's mostly signature and mostly signature based. And also, very, the assumption is that, it's an all-in-one solution. In a cloud environment, particularly as I said earlier, right? Like your firewall just doesn't exist anymore. I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist, but you're transforming that model a lot, right? Like depending on your service, which service in Azure, in AWS you're using, you may not have the opportunity. So if you focus a lot on the IPS, I've seen organizations that invest a lot, right? Like you have the best people, custom coding every single signature. Yes, that you can be quite successful there. But then that model does not transition well to your cloud environment, right? Again, you cannot deploy cloud, intrusion prevention system across all of Google's infrastructure. That's their job, right? So, in a lot of ways, this is, getting to become a legacy and deprecated in most of the, new generation of cloud service offering. That's what I was referring to. Is not, if you're using IaaS, infrastructure as a service, basically renting servers and so on, you want to match up with your existing network, yeah, then it would work. I would take on one more because I think we're running out of time. Yep, please compare and contrast your approach with SaaS and IaaS. So software as a service and infrastructure as a service. It looks like a presentation focuses more on PaaS. Yes, this presentation has an assumption that, I think that was, sort of the opening statement, and I'm happy to go back over there as well. Yeah, cloud is not just a bunch of servers that are outsourced. IaaS is that. And definitely a lot of organizations start there, and rightfully so. But as you adopt cloud, right, and this is also about security practices that you're planning forward for, right? So, all organizations that are successful in the cloud world are using all those PaaS and SaaS services. So we want to make sure that, your practices align with the, with the future state, and also making sure that you're ready for full cloud adoption, right? Like I would not call it a full cloud adoption if you're just using the IaaS component. You're just really doing, extending your data center at that point, right? So that's what I would say. And then let me see here. Yeah, and I would also say that a lot of those practices we definitely covered in some of the course. It's just not in the scope of today's presentation about how to protect SaaS and so on. So with that, I'm going to end the presentation here. I'll turn it back over to Carol. Thanks everyone for coming.
All right, thank you so much, Jason, for your great presentation, and to Cisco for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.